The dark reason why 40% of kids can't read properly is not that they can no longer recognize words. Many of them can apparently read a sentence aloud without any difficulty. And yet, just a few seconds later, they still have no idea what it meant. They read the words, but not the thought behind them. And that is where a crisis begins that is far bigger than it seems at first glance. A teacher writes a simple assignment on the board. The children copy it into their notebooks, word for word. As soon as they are finished, the first hands go up. They want to know what they are supposed to do now. The answer is right in front of them. They have read every word, but they have not understood the assignment. That is exactly what makes this crisis so difficult to see. Children are growing up in a world where they constantly read messages, subtitles, comments, and search results. Yet many of them struggle to follow a longer train of thought. How can a generation see thousands of words every day and still have increasing difficulty understanding what they actually mean? A boy is asked at school to read a short text and then answer 3 questions about it. A few minutes later, the worksheet is still almost blank. So he takes out his phone, photographs the text, and lets an app explain the answers. Technically, he completed the assignment, but he barely did any reading. From his perspective, that actually makes perfect sense. Why spend 10 minutes working through a difficult text when the answer appears in 10 seconds? Faced with a tax return, most adults would probably make exactly the same choice. Reading is not just another school subject. It is the foundation for independently learning almost every other subject, and with it, knowledge itself. That requires organizing concepts, recognizing connections, and separating important information from unimportant information. But that process increasingly feels unnecessary to many children because the finished answer is already available. As a result, reading loses not only its appeal, but also its obvious purpose. And a skill whose usefulness becomes invisible is very difficult to practice with effort. A girl is supposed to read 20 pages for school at home. After 2 pages, she quickly checks her phone. Just for a second, of course. Reply to a message, watch one video, then immediately go back to the book. 20 minutes later, she suddenly knows an astonishing amount about the morning routine of a stranger she will never meet, but she no longer remembers what was on page 2. It sounds funny, but it is actually quite revealing. And you have probably experienced this effect yourself. You pick up your phone for just a moment, and suddenly the thought you were following is gone. A book waits patiently. It does not flash, make a sound, or show you something completely new after 7 seconds. Honestly, a novel can hardly compete with the constant stream of stimulation from a smartphone. Reading demands something that is trained less and less today, staying with one thing even when nothing new happens immediately. This is known as reading stamina, the ability to stay with a longer text, keep information in your mind, and not mentally check out every time a sentence becomes more difficult. This ability does not develop automatically. It is built much like physical endurance in sports. Someone who is used almost exclusively to short pieces of text loses the thread much more quickly when reading longer passages. The child may still recognize every single word, but no longer understand how the sentences are connected. At the same time, this very kind of endurance is becoming less necessary in a digital environment. The moment something becomes difficult, slow, or boring, the next stimulus is already waiting. As a result, attention becomes accustomed to jumping ahead before a longer thought has even been fully processed. But even undivided attention is not enough. Reading comprehension also depends on how many concepts and connections a child already has in their mind. 2 students can read the exact same paragraph and still understand something completely different. If a child reads about an eruption, a magma chamber, and volcanic pressure, a mental picture only forms if those concepts are already connected. Without that background knowledge, individual words remain isolated and meaningless. To you, a text like that may seem incredibly easy. You already know those concepts and automatically connect them. A child, on the other hand, can lose the thread after just 3 sentences. Not because they are thinking too little, but because every unfamiliar word creates extra mental work. Eventually, working memory becomes so overloaded that the beginning of the sentence has already disappeared before the end is reached. This becomes especially problematic when difficult words are immediately skipped or replaced with short explanations. The text becomes easier to get through, but the child's vocabulary barely grows. The next text is missing those same words all over again. In this way, a child can spend years reading without reading ever becoming noticeably easier. The deceptive part is this: as long as only fluent reading aloud is being assessed, this weakness remains largely invisible. It only becomes visible when a text is supposed to trigger an action or convey new knowledge. A student who does not truly understand a text does not just have a problem in language arts. In math, they struggle with word problems. In physics, with understanding an experiment. And in history, with figuring out what the question is actually asking. Eventually, it seems as though they have difficulties in every subject, even though the same underlying cause is often responsible. Many children then develop remarkably creative strategies. Some become loud, others make jokes, and some suddenly find something extremely important to look for in their backpack. Anything is better than showing the whole class that they did not understand the assignment. I can even understand that. Who would voluntarily say, "Sorry, I just read every single word and still have no idea what this says"? From the outside, you do not see a child with a reading problem. You see a child who disrupts the class, refuses to do assignments, or withdraws more and more. That is why the real problem is so easily overlooked. People start talking about discipline and motivation, even though the actual cause lies in poor reading comprehension. This creates a cycle that quietly reinforces itself. Those who struggle to understand texts do not enjoy reading. Those who read less encounter fewer new words, sentence structures, and ideas. That makes the next text even more demanding. While strong readers become faster with every book, weaker readers need more and more energy for the very same page. At school, this difference initially seems small. One child takes 5 minutes longer, asks more questions, or writes a shorter answer. A few years later, that same gap suddenly appears in almost every subject. Then people quickly say that the child is simply not that type of learner, or just cannot concentrate. Labels like these are convenient because they reduce a complicated development to a simple sentence. But for the child, they easily become an explanation of their own identity. They no longer say, "This text is difficult." They say, "I can't do this." From that moment on, every new page becomes not just another assignment, but a possible confirmation of their own inability. And by this point, the issue no longer ends with children, because you also depend every day on correctly understanding texts. Contracts, news, forms, and political statements rarely consist of 3 simple sentences with a funny video underneath. Anyone who cannot reliably interpret those texts also remains dependent on other people's explanations outside of school. What becomes visible here is larger than a simple reading crisis. Reading merely reveals, especially early, what has already been happening in many other areas. Information is accepted before it has been processed independently. A child asks a question, immediately receives an answer from a search engine or AI, and accepts it. No reflection, no doubt, and no moment in which they have to check whether the answer even fits the question. To be honest, adults have been doing exactly the same thing for a long time. We read a headline, become outraged instantly, and sometimes discover days later that the article said something completely different, assuming we even opened it. When reading, there is normally a certain resistance between a question and its answer. Concepts have to be organized, contradictions noticed, and some sentences read twice. It is precisely within that delay that genuine thinking begins. If that delay is removed with a single click, only the result remains. Anyone who only receives answers does not automatically lose knowledge. They lose something far less visible: the practice of judging an answer for themselves. The decisive divide of the future will therefore not be between people who can read and people who cannot. It will be between those who receive an answer and those who can still recognize whether it is true. The disturbing part is not that systems are producing better and better answers. It is that people are becoming accustomed, at an ever earlier age, to handing over the task of evaluating those answers. Because what happens when a generation can decipher every sentence, but no longer notices which sentence is doing the thinking for them?